I'm going to go over the different steps that went into creating and ratifying the United States Constitution. As you already know, by the late 1780s, there were a lot of different issues that had emerged with the Confederation government that had been set up by the Articles of Confederation. So at that point, delegates from the different states decided to meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to discuss ways that they might improve upon or change those Articles of Confederation. They met at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which was also where the Declaration of Independence had been signed on July 4th, 1776. So even though they all agreed to meet, it didn't mean that they were all going to agree on how the changes should take place. So right away, different disagreements started to happen. And one of the big divisions that started to emerge was one between large and small states. Now, we're not talking about geographic size here, we're talking about population. So you might remember that with the Articles of Confederation, each state had equal representation to the Confederation government. What large states like Virginia wanted was to change that so that every state had representation based on its population. Small states like New Jersey wanted to keep it like it was under the Confederation government because, of course, that would have benefited them a little bit more. So what they ended up doing was getting to a great compromise that created two houses of Congress, one of which, the Senate, would have equal representation, and the other of which, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population. So that was the great compromise that really helped to sort of bring the large and small states together. Now, the other issue was between southern states and northern states. As you probably know, the northern states were far less dependent on slavery, and actually by this point in history, many of these states had started to outlaw slavery. But southern states still had slavery, and there were hundreds of thousands of slaves living in the southern states. So the southern states really wanted to count the slaves as part of their populations because, of course, that would mean they would get more representation in government. However, they didn't want their slave population to be counted when it came to determining taxation. So they kind of wanted to have it both ways. The northern states wanted to have the slaves counted for taxation and opposed using their population to determine how many representatives each southern state should have in the House of Representatives. So again, there was a compromise needed, and this came to be known as the 3/5 compromise because, bizarrely enough, they agreed to count 3/5 of each slave instead of the whole person for purposes of population and representation. So the Great Compromise and the 3/5 compromise are the two big compromises that helped to move the Constitution forward. Now, a lot of people were concerned that the new government that was formed was way too powerful. It did have a lot more power than the Confederation government, and this caused a great deal of concern because a lot of people felt like the reason for the American Revolution and the reason for breaking away from Britain was to get away from a central government that had that much power. So to be putting a government back in place that had more power caused a lot of concern for people. So there was a system that was put in place of three branches of government, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And this was all written into the Constitution. And these three branches had a system of checks and balances that were also written into the Constitution with the idea that no single branch of government could get too powerful. So this system of checks and balances looks something like this. So you can see that there are certain powers that each branch of government has over the other two branches. And the idea there, again, is that no single branch of government will ever get too powerful. So this was sort of done to address the concerns of people who felt like the government would become too powerful. But there were still people who felt like there was too much power for the federal government, which is the central government that was being built, and not enough protection for individuals' rights and states' rights, specifically written into the Constitution. So this was sort of an ongoing concern that was going to be addressed a little bit later. So finally, the Constitution is written. It's completed by the fall of 1787, and now it's time to ratify it or formally approve it. So there were a few gentlemen who were not really put in charge, but kind of took ownership of the Constitution and the attempt to try to get it ratified in all the states. And these guys were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Together, these three men wrote a long series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. Originally, these were published anonymously, but historians have been able to go back and kind of look at the writing styles and determine in each and every case who wrote the essay, and it was pretty much always one of these three guys. So the Federalist Papers were designed to sort of convince people around the country that the Constitution was a good thing and that it should be ratified. So they were writing these essays to kind of counter the arguments of the anti-federalists who were trying to derail the Constitution and its ratification. So the anti-federalists really wanted a weak federal government, and if the Constitution was going to be approved, they wanted a Bill of Rights added that would specifically address the rights of the people and of the states. Now, Federalists argued that the Bill of Rights wasn't needed because federal power was already limited. But in order to push through ratification in all of the states, the Federalists eventually did agree to add a Bill of Rights. And so the Constitution was successfully ratified in 1788, and they needed to have 9 of the 13 colonies ratify it for it to take effect. And that's what happened, and then the new government was formed in 1789. Right away, James Madison wrote a bunch of amendments or changes to the Constitution, and these became our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And we'll go over what's in the Bill of Rights in our next chapter. So this is what ratification voting looked like. You can see that some of these states ratified in 1787, some ratified in 1788, and some ratified in 1789. But the Constitution actually took effect, as I mentioned, as soon as 9 states had ratified because it needed a 2/3 majority. So that is how our new government was formed. The Constitution was ratified in June of 1788. The first Congress met in March of 1789, and our first president, George Washington, was inaugurated in April of 1789.